How did one solitary figure, standing just 5 feet tall, come to define a century of such explosive speed, steam, and global transformation that the world would never be the same again? It is a question that invites us to look beyond the statues and the stern portraits in black mourning dress. It invites us to find the young woman beneath the crown. Tonight, we step back into the gaslit haze of the 19th century, walking the corridors of power and the cobblestones of a changing empire. We will witness the dawn of an age that bears her name, feeling the vibration of the first steam trains and hearing the rustle of silk in the royal court. If you enjoy these journeys into the past, please take a moment to like and subscribe to support the channel. And I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what time is it on your clock? It is always wonderful to visualize our global community settling in together. Now, go ahead and find a comfortable position, relax your shoulders, and let the noise of the modern day fade away. Welcome to Sleeping Scribe, where calming history stories help you unwind and gently fall asleep. Tonight, we travel back to a crisp morning in June 1837, where a young woman is about to wake up to a new destiny. The story begins not with a queen in her majesty, but with a lonely child in a gilded cage. Victoria was born on May 24, 1819, at Kensington Palace. Her arrival was a fragile candle flame in a gusty wind. Her father, Prince Edward, the Duke of Kent, died when she was merely an infant, leaving her alone with her mother, the Duchess of Kent. It was here, within the red brick walls of Kensington, that her childhood was shaped by a suffocating regime known as the Kensington system. Devised by her mother and the ambitious advisor, Sir John Conroy, this system was designed to make Victoria dependent, weak, and utterly controlled. The air in the palace felt still and heavy, filled with the dust motes dancing in the silent, stifling air of a house waiting for a king to die. For 18 years, Victoria was never allowed to be alone. She slept in her mother's room every night, her small bed placed right beside the Duchess's, ensuring that even her dreams were monitored. She could not walk down a hallway without someone holding her hand. She could not see visitors without a witness. Her days were spent with her dolls, and the sound of a doll's house latch clicking shut became the defining rhythm of her lonely play. She created elaborate lives for these wooden figures because her own life was so devoid of genuine connection. The heavy velvet curtains of the palace were drawn tight to block out the world, keeping the young princess in a perpetual twilight of isolation. Yet, outside those curtains, the political landscape was shifting. King William IV, her uncle, was an old man, but he possessed a fierce determination. He famously declared at a dinner party, with the Duchess of Kent present, that he intended to live until Victoria turned 18. His goal was simple. He wanted to avoid a regency where Victoria's mother and Conroy would rule in her name. He held on, fighting illness and age, until the young princess crossed that threshold into adulthood. The king's resolve held until the very end. He died in the early hours of June 20th, 1837, just weeks after Victoria turned 18. The transfer of power began before the sun had fully risen. It was 6 o'clock in the morning. The palace was quiet, save for the chirping of birds in the gardens and the distant, rhythmic clatter of horse hooves on gravel at dawn. A carriage arrived at the gates, carrying the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Chamberlain, Lord Conyngham. They had come from Windsor Castle with news that would change the world. Victoria was awoken by her mother. But this morning was different. The air felt charged with a strange, new energy. She was told that important visitors were waiting. For the first time in her life, she did not wait for permission. She rose and threw a cotton dressing gown over her nightdress. Her hair was loose, falling down her back. She walked down the stairs. The sensation was entirely novel. She was walking alone. There was no hand gripping hers, no shadow looming over her shoulder. She held the coolness of a silver candlestick in her hand, descending the stairs to meet her destiny. When she entered the room, the two powerful men fell to their knees. They addressed her as Your Majesty. The king was dead. She was queen. In that moment, the Kensington system shattered. The girl who had been silenced for 18 years found her voice. Later that day, she held her first council with the Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne. Melbourne would become her first mentor and confidant, a father figure who guided her through the labyrinth of politics. But before the politics began, there was a personal reclamation to be made. Her first order as queen was simple, domestic, and profoundly symbolic. She turned to the servants and said, "Bring me my bed." She ordered her bed to be moved out of her mother's room. That night, for the first time in her life, the Queen of England slept alone. With her freedom secured, the young queen now faced the pageantry of her public anointing. A year later, on June 28th, London transformed into a theater of spectacle for her coronation. The city was exploding. The population was approaching 2 million people, a sprawling, smoky metropolis that was becoming the center of the world. For the coronation, 400,000 visitors flooded into London. The streets were a chaotic mix of celebration and grime. It was a city of contrasts. There were the rich in their carriages and the poor in their rags, all jostling for a glimpse of the teenage queen. The immersive details of that day were overwhelming. The deafening peal of church bells rang across the city skyline, a constant, joyous cacophony that started before dawn. The air was thick with the scent of roasting chestnuts and coal smoke mingling in the crowds. People climbed onto roofs, hung from lampposts, and packed every inch of the pavement. Victoria rode in the gold state coach. It was an immense, gilded carriage, a fairy tale brought to life, yet it rocked violently on its leather straps, making the ride uncomfortable. As she looked out the glass windows, she saw the roar of the crowd, a living sea of faces cheering her name. The contrast between the golden coach and the muddy, crowded streets was the perfect image of her empire splendor rising from the soot of industry. The ceremony itself took place in Westminster Abbey and lasted for 5 arduous hours. It was grand, but it was also notoriously under-rehearsed and chaotic. The clergy had not practiced enough, and they often fumbled their lines. At one point, the Bishop of Durham accidentally put the ring on the wrong finger, forcing it on so hard that Victoria was in pain. Yet, amidst the confusion, there were moments of unscripted humanity. Lord Rolle, an elderly peer in his 80s, attempted to ascend the steps to pay homage to the Queen. He stumbled and fell, rolling down the stairs. A gasp went through the abbey. Ignoring protocol, Victoria stood up and advanced to help him, a gesture of kindness that endeared her to everyone present. She wore the George IV state diadem, a heavy circlet of diamonds and pearls, on her way to the abbey. But for the moment of crowning, a new crown had been made. The old royal crown was too heavy for a 19-year-old girl. The new imperial state crown was created specifically for her, glittering with thousands of precious stones. Even so, she wrote later in her diary, about the weight of it, both the physical burden on her head and the symbolic burden on her spirit. The atmosphere in the abbey was a mix of the sacred and the strange. The shimmering gold thread of the coronation robes caught the candlelight, creating an aura of divinity around her. She described the tactile sensation of the heavy, cold orb placed in her hand, a sphere representing the globe she was now sovereign over. She wrote of the noise and confusion, but also of the immense pride she felt. When she finally returned to the palace, she washed her dog, Dash, a simple act that grounded her after a day of being treated like a deity. Amidst the crowds and the crown, a personal romance was brewing that would define her reign. The young queen was powerful, but she was also lonely. That changed in October 1839. Her cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, came to visit. They had met before, but this time was different. Victoria was struck by his beauty and his intellect. He was serious, studious, and possessed a quiet intensity that matched her own. The attraction was immediate and undeniable. However, royal protocol dictated a unique dynamic. Albert could not propose to a reigning monarch. It was Victoria who had to ask the question. On October 15, 1839, just a few days after his arrival, she summoned him to her private room. One can imagine the nervous flutter in her chest. She was the most powerful woman in the world. Yet, in this moment, she was simply a young woman in love. She told him that it would make her too happy if he would consent to what she wished. He embraced her warmly, and the deal was struck. The wedding took place the following year, on February 10, 1840, at the Chapel Royal in St. James's Palace. The weather was dreadful. It was pouring rain on the wedding day, the water lashing against the windows of the palace. But the gloom outside could not dampen the brilliance inside. Victoria made a choice that day that would ripple through history. In an era where royal brides often wore heavy brocades of silver and gold, Victoria chose white. She wore a dress of white silk satin. The fabric was rich and lustrous, creating a soft rustle of heavy silk as she walked the aisle. The dress was more than a fashion statement. It was a political one. It featured a deep flounce of Honiton lace, chosen specifically to support the struggling cottage industry of lacemakers in Devon. By wearing it, she revived their trade. On her head, she eschewed the heavy diamonds of the state. Instead, she wore a simple wreath of fresh orange blossoms, their scent sweet and heady, symbolizing purity and fertility. The ceremony was emotional. Albert, looking handsome in his British Field Marshal uniform, promised to love and cherish her. Victoria, the Queen, vowed to obey him, a point of contention for some, but a choice she made willingly as a wife. After the wedding, they traveled to Windsor Castle for their honeymoon. It was a brief and somewhat chaotic escape. The young queen could not simply stop ruling. They spent their first evenings together in the private chambers at Windsor, with the warmth of the fire crackling in the hearth. Yet, alongside the romance, there was work. Victoria spent part of her honeymoon working on boxes of government papers, with Albert sitting nearby. It was the beginning of a complex partnership. Albert was intelligent and eager to work, but he had no official role. He was the husband of the Queen, but not the king. He introduced German traditions to the court, most famously the Christmas tree, which he decorated with candles and sweets, creating a tradition that families follow to this day. But initially, there was a struggle. Victoria resisted his attempts to help with state affairs. It would take time for them to become the dual monarchs they were destined to be. The scratch of a quill pen filled the silence of their evenings, as Victoria wrote in her diary. She described those early days as a dream, calling herself the most happy of women. While the couple settled into domestic life, the world outside was speeding up on iron rails. The Industrial Revolution was no longer just a concept. It was a physical reality, crashing into the ancient landscape of Britain. The symbol of this new age was the steam train. For centuries, travel had been limited to the speed of a horse. Now, massive iron engines were being forged, belching smoke and fire, capable of speeds that seemed impossible to the average person. This phenomenon was known as railway mania. Thousands of miles of track were being laid across the green fields of England. It was a chaotic, fervent expansion. The older aristocracy looked at these machines with terror, viewing them as loud, dirty monsters that ruined the countryside and frightened the livestock. But Prince Albert was a man of science. He was fascinated by technology and progress. He encouraged Victoria to embrace the future. In June 1842, Victoria became the first monarch to travel by train. It was a journey that signaled the end of the old world. The trip was scheduled from Slough, near Windsor Castle, to Paddington Station in London. The Royal Saloon was a marvel of Victorian luxury. It was not like the open, sooty carriages of the lower classes. It was fitted with plush silk walls and heavy drapes, designed to look like a drawing room on wheels. The train itself was driven by none other than Isambard Kingdom Brunel, the legendary engineer, or perhaps by his superintendent Daniel Gooch. History sometimes blurs the driver, but the expertise was undeniable. As the Queen stepped onto the train, she felt the vibration of the floorboards beneath her royal feet. It was a living, breathing machine. The whistle blew, a piercing shriek of steam that echoed across the fields, sending birds scattering into the sky. Then the movement began. The rhythmic chug-chug of the steam engine gained momentum, slowly at first, then faster. The sensation of speed was unlike anything she had ever felt. The average speed of a horse-drawn coach was about 10 miles per hour. The train reached speeds of over 40 or 50 miles per hour. Victoria looked out the window. The world was transforming. The blur of the green English countryside rushed past trees, hedges, and cows became streaks of color. The smell of burning coal and hot oil permeated the air, the scent of the industrial age. The journey took roughly 25 minutes. In that short time, the concept of distance was shattered. The standardization of time itself became necessary. Before trains, every town kept its own local time based on the sun. But trains required precise schedules. Thus, Greenwich Mean Time was adopted, unifying the clocks of the nation to the rhythm of the railway. When they arrived at Paddington, the Queen was reportedly thrilled. She had traveled faster than any human in history had traveled just a few decades prior. The Iron Horse had received the royal seal of approval. This network of iron rails was merely the skeleton of a growing beast. Soon the empire would put its might on full display as we imagine the steam engines roaring through the countryside. I wonder, is there another era of great invention or a specific historical figure whose life story you would love to explore in this relaxing format? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I always enjoy reading your suggestions. While the Iron Horse was carving its path through the quiet countryside, the heart of the empire was preparing for a spectacle that would outshine anything the world had ever seen. We move now from the soot of the early railways to a structure so ethereal, so filled with light, that it seemed to float upon the grass of Hyde Park. It was the year 1851. The world was quieting down after decades of revolution and war, and Prince Albert, now fully settled into his role as the Queen's partner, possessed a vision. He believed that peace could be maintained not by armies, but by trade, industry, and the shared genius of mankind. His dream materialized in the form of the Great Exhibition. Imagine standing in Hyde Park on a spring morning in May. The grass is dewy, the air is fresh, and rising before you is a mountain of glass. This was the Crystal Palace, designed by Joseph Paxton, a man who had spent his life building greenhouses for dukes. The structure was inspired by the organic architecture of the giant water lily. It was a cathedral of the industrial age, constructed entirely of cast iron and plate glass. The sheer audacity of the building was enough to silence the critics. It stretched for nearly 2,000 feet, a glittering ribcage of metal that caught the sun and fractured it into a million blinding, dazzling beams. It was built around the existing elm trees of the park, enclosing them within its transparent walls, so that nature itself seemed to be attending the exhibition. On the opening day, the 1st of May, the mood was one of supreme optimism. Queen Victoria described it in her diary as a day to live forever. She arrived in a carriage procession that wound through crowds so dense they were described as a solid wall of humanity. Over 6 million people would eventually visit the exhibition, equivalent to 1/3 of the entire population of Britain at the time. They came from the smoky manufacturing towns of the north, arriving on the very trains we just imagined. They came from the quiet villages of the coast, and they came from across the channel, all drawn to this beacon of progress. Walking inside, the sensory experience was overwhelming. The first thing to hit you was the light. After the dark, cramped interiors of typical Georgian houses, the Crystal Palace felt like stepping into the sky itself. The sunlight refrained through thousands of glass panes, illuminating the vast interior with a clarity that was almost spiritual. Then there was the sound. In the central court, a massive crystal fountain made of 4 tons of pink glass shot water 27 feet into the air. The splash and ripple of the water provided a cooling, rhythmic background noise that echoed off the hard surfaces. But beneath the water's song was the hum of the future. The machinery court was alive with the clicking, whirring, and thumping of the latest inventions. Steam engines, hydraulic presses, and cotton spinning machines were all in motion, a symphony of British engineering prowess. The air inside was warm, humid, and filled with the scent of the tropical plants that Paxton had arranged to break up the endless lines of exhibits. But mixed with the scent of ferns and palms was the smell of the crowd perfume, wool, and the dust of thousands of shoes shuffling across the wooden floorboards. The gaps between the floorboards were designed to let dust fall through, a clever bit of practical engineering, but they also created a distinct, hollow echo as millions of feet wandered the aisles. The exhibits themselves were a chaotic treasure trove. There were 100,000 objects on display. You could see a knife with 1,800 blades, a piece of coal weighing 24 tons, and the legendary Koh-i-Noor diamond locked in a gilded cage. Though the diamond was reportedly disappointing to some because of its dull cut, it drew crowds who stood in line for hours just to catch a glimpse of the stone that had once belonged to Mughal emperors. It was a place where the ordinary became extraordinary. Charlotte Brontë, the author of Jane Eyre, visited the palace and wrote that it seemed as if it had been plucked from the pages of the Arabian Nights. It was a magic hall where genies had conjured up the wealth of the world. There were, of course, hiccups in this paradise. The elm trees, enclosed within the glass, became home to a flock of sparrows. The birds, trapped inside, began to cause a mess on the exhibits and the visitors below. The Queen was distressed, and the solution came from the Duke of Wellington, who supposedly remarked, "Sparrowhawks, ma'am." Whether hawks were actually used is a matter of debate, but it illustrates the collision of the natural world with this artificial wonder. The Great Exhibition was the first World's Fair, a concept that continues to this day. It was a celebration of peace, a moment where the world paused to admire its own reflection in the glass. The profits from the event were so substantial that they were used to purchase land in South Kensington, founding the cultural quarter that now houses the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Science Museum, and the Natural History Museum. Every time a student walks into those halls today, they are walking on the legacy of Prince Albert's glass dream. While the Crystal Palace celebrated the fruits of global trade, the reality of where those fruits came from was far more complex. The exhibition was a window into an empire that was rapidly expanding across the oceans. The phrase, "the empire on which the sun never sets," was not just poetic hyperbole, it was a geographical fact. By the end of the century, the British Empire would cover 25% of the world's land surface. At the heart of this expansion was India, the jewel in the crown. The relationship between Britain and India was shifting dramatically during these years. For a long time, India had been managed by the East India Company, a corporate entity with its own army. But following the violent upheavals of 1857, the British government decided that the subcontinent could no longer be ruled by a company. The Government of India Act of 1858 transferred power directly to the Crown. This change brought the flavors, colors, and textures of the East directly into the British domestic sphere. If you walked the docks of London in the 1860s or 70s, the sensory shift was immediate. The smell of the Thames, usually thick with mud and coal, would suddenly be cut through by the sharp, pungent aroma of cloves, cinnamon, and pepper. Clipper ships, their tall masts swaying like a forest in the breeze, arrived daily. The smell of salt spray and tar on their decks told stories of months at sea. They unloaded crates stamped with the names of distant ports: Bombay, Calcutta, Madras. Out of these crates poured the vibrant reds and golds of Indian textiles. Silks so fine they could pass through a wedding ring, and cashmeres that brought warmth to the damp British winters. But the most pervasive import was tea. It was during Victoria's reign that tea cemented itself as the national drink. The taste of the first cup of Darjeeling, steeped in a delicate porcelain cup, became a ritual in every household, from the palace to the cottage. It was a taste of the empire, a daily reminder of the lands that lay beyond the horizon. Victoria herself was fascinated by India, though she never set foot on its soil. Her connection was one of imagination and correspondence. Later in her life, she would employ an Indian servant named Abdul Karim, who became her teacher, or munshi. He taught her to read and write in Urdu and Hindi. One can imagine the Queen in her private rooms at Windsor, practicing the curling script of a language spoken by millions of her subjects whom she would never meet. In 1876, at the instigation of her Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, Victoria was proclaimed Empress of India. It was a title that delighted her. She commissioned a new room at her home on the Isle of Wight, Osborne House. The Durbar room was designed with intricate Indian plasterwork, peacock motifs, and displayed gifts sent from Indian princes. It was a fantasy of India, a curated museum where the heavy, humid heat of a Bombay afternoon was replaced by the cool sea breeze of the English Channel, but the visual splendor remained. The connection between Britain and India was physically shortened in 1869 with the opening of the Suez Canal. This engineering marvel sliced through the sands of Egypt, connecting the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. Suddenly, the journey to India did not require a perilous voyage around the tip of Africa. The world was shrinking. The Royal Navy, with its ironclad ships, patrolled these trade routes, ensuring that the flow of goods and the flow of power remained uninterrupted. But let us return from the exotic reaches of the empire to the center of the web. Let us return to London. If the Crystal Palace was the dream of the Victorian era, London was its gritty, beating heart. It was a city of unparalleled size and energy, but also a city of deep shadows. To understand the texture of everyday life in Victorian London, one must first understand the air. The city was powered by coal, millions of chimneys, from the great factories to the humblest hearths, belched smoke into the sky, day and night. When the weather turned still and damp, this smoke would descend and mix with the river fog, creating a phenomenon known as the pea souper. This was not a gentle mist. It was a thick, yellow, choking fog that you could taste. The acrid taste of coal dust would settle in the back of the throat. It stung the eyes and blackened the nostrils. In these fogs, visibility could drop to a few feet. People would lose their way in their own neighborhoods. The world would vanish, leaving only the muffled sounds of the city to guide you. Through this gloom, the gaslights burned. The introduction of gaslighting had turned night into day, but in the fog, the lamps were reduced to glowing halos of yellow light, suspended in the darkness like spectral eyes. The soundscape of London was a constant, rhythmic roar. The streets were paved with granite cobblestones, and the clip-clop of iron horseshoes echoed incessantly. Thousands of horses pulled omnibuses, hansom cabs, and delivery carts. The noise was so deafening that when someone in a wealthy household fell ill, straw would be laid thick across the street outside to dampen the sound of the traffic. Beneath the noise and the fog, there was a crisis of sanitation. The city had grown too fast. The ancient cesspits were overflowing, and for years, raw waste was dumped directly into the River Thames. In the hot summer of 1858, the smell became so unbearable that it was named the Great Stink. The stench was so powerful that it penetrated the curtains of the Houses of Parliament, forcing the politicians to soak their curtains in chloride of lime and eventually suspend their sessions. It was a moment of reckoning. The engineer Joseph Bazalgette was brought in to save the city. He constructed a massive, intricate network of brick sewers beneath the streets, a subterranean cathedral of engineering that intercepted the waste and carried it away. It was a project of immense scale, requiring millions of bricks, and it effectively saved London from cholera and typhus. It was the veins and arteries of the modern city, hidden beneath the mud. This London was the London of Charles Dickens. He was writing Bleak House and Oliver Twist during these very years, capturing the sharp divide between the West End and the East End in the West. Wealthy ladies in crinoline dresses shopped in the new department stores. In the east, mudlark-softened children waded through the sludge of the riverbanks at low tide, searching for dropped coins, bits of coal, or scrap metal to sell. Yet, despite the grime, there was a sense of pulsating life. The bobbies, the officers of the Metropolitan Police, in their tall hats and blue tunics, walked the beat, becoming iconic symbols of order in the chaos. The streets were filled with street sellers crying out their wares: fresh watercress, hot eels, matches. It was a city that never really slept, a city where the chime of Big Ben, installed in 1859, told the hour over a sprawl of humanity that was struggling, striving, and surviving. The sensation of cold, damp river air clinging to a wool coat was a familiar feeling to every Londoner. It was a city of texture, the scratch of rough wool, the slickness of wet cobblestones, the grit of soot. But while the physical world was crowded and dense, invisible lines were being drawn that would cut through the fog and connect the world instantly. We have spoken of the railways connecting the country and the ships connecting the empire, but the true revolution of this era was the wire. The electric telegraph was the Victorian internet, a miracle that annihilated distance. Developed by inventors like Cook and Wheatstone, the telegraph spread alongside the railways. Where the tracks went, the wires followed, strung on wooden poles that marched across the landscape. For the first time in human history, information could travel faster than a messenger could carry it. The rhythmic tap, dash, tap, dash, tap of the telegraph key became the heartbeat of the modern age. It was a language of dots and dashes that could carry news of a birth, a death, or a stock market crash across the country in minutes. But the greatest challenge lay in the ocean. Connecting Britain to America required laying a cable across the floor of the Atlantic Ocean. It was a task of Herculean difficulty. The first successful attempt in 1858 was a moment of global jubilation. Queen Victoria exchanged the first official message with President Buchanan of the United States. The message, which would have taken weeks to arrive by ship, arrived in hours. However, that first cable failed after only a few weeks. The insulation broke down, and the line went dead. It was a crushing blow, but the Victorians were not people to give up. They returned in 1866 with the SS Great Eastern, a ship designed by Brunel that was so large it was the only vessel capable of carrying the thousands of miles of cable needed. Imagine the scene on the deck of the Great Eastern, the hiss of the rough Atlantic seas against the hull, the tension of the engineers watching the cable unspool into the black depths of the water. They were stitching the continents together. When the 1866 cable was finally secured, the world changed forever. The psychological distance between nations collapsed. A merchant in London could know the price of cotton in New York before he went to lunch. This desire to capture and keep the world extended to the visual realm as well. Photography was born in these decades. The daguerreotype and the calotype allowed time to be frozen. For the first time, a mother could have an image of her child that was not a painting, but a trace of light itself. The smell of chemicals in a photographer's darkroom became the scent of memory. The Queen herself became an avid collector of photographs, amassing thousands of images of her family, her soldiers, and her subjects. Communication became cheaper and more accessible to everyone, not just the rich. The penny post, introduced in 1840, allowed anyone to send a letter anywhere in the UK for just 1 penny. The penny black stamp was the key. the crisp feel of a new envelope, the taste of the gum on the stamp. The anticipation of the postman's knock. These became universal experiences. People wrote millions of letters, pouring out their hearts, their business, and their gossip onto paper. And then, towards the end of this period of high invention, came the voice. In 1878, Alexander Graham Bell demonstrated the telephone to Queen Victoria at Osborne House. She was enchanted. She held the receiver to her ear and listened with wonder as a voice traveled through the wire. She described it as most extraordinary. The static-filled sound was the whisper of the 20th century, arriving early. The world was shrinking. The vast, terrifying distances of the globe were being tamed by copper, wire, and steam. The map was being filled in. The silence of isolation was being replaced by the hum of connection. But just as the world seemed to be brightening with progress, a shadow was about to fall over the Queen. The zenith of the Victorian noon was brilliant, blinding, and full of noise. But the afternoon would bring a quietness, a grief so profound that it would change the very color of the monarchy. It is fascinating to think how the telegraph was the internet of its day, shrinking the vast distance between continents. It makes one wonder how they would perceive our instant connection today. I hope you are feeling more relaxed as we travel through this era together. The bright, clattering noon of the Victorian age began to soften into the longer shadows of the afternoon. We have traveled through the noise of the steam engines, the glare of the Crystal Palace, and the bustling streets of a London that never slept. But now the tempo of our journey must change. We are entering the twilight of the reign, a time of deep shadows, profound silence, and a slow, rhythmic march toward history. The air grows still. The frantic energy of the Industrial Revolution settles into a steady, heavy hum. We find ourselves now not in the public squares, but in the private, hushed corridors of Windsor Castle. It is here that the story of the Queen transforms from a tale of power into a timeless story of love and loss. It begins in the Blue Room. The year was 1861. It was a year that had started with such promise but was ending in a suffocating gloom. The winter had been harsh, damp, and unyielding. Prince Albert, the man who had been the engine of the monarchy, the intellect behind the Great Exhibition, and the father of the royal family, was unwell. He had been suffering for weeks with vague pains, insomnia, and a terrible fatigue. The doctors whispered of typhoid fever, though modern minds now wonder if it was something else, perhaps Crohn's disease or a stomach cancer that had been quietly eroding his strength for years. On December 14th, the atmosphere in Windsor Castle was heavy with dread. The Blue Room, where the prince lay, was draped in shadows. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn against the cold night, but they could not keep out the chill of mortality. At 11:10 that night, the prince's breathing changed. The Queen, who had been hovering by his side, terrified and praying, knelt closer. She whispered his name. He did not answer. With 2 long breaths, the light of her life went out. A scream echoed through the stone corridors of the Casala Raw, primal sound of agony that purportedly frightened the servants in distant wings. It was the sound of a heartbreaking. At 42 years old, Victoria was a widow. The silence that followed that scream lasted for 40 years. The devastation was total. Victoria did not just mourn, she collapsed. For the first few days, she refused to believe he was truly gone. When reality finally settled in, she made a vow that would define the rest of her existence. She would live as if he were still alive. The blue room was preserved as a shrine. It was frozen in time, a museum of the moment he left. Nothing was moved. His favorite books were left on the table. His pocket watch remained where he had placed it. But this was not just a static preservation. It was an active, eerie ritual. Every single morning, for the next 4 decades, servants brought a jug of hot shaving water to the room. They laid out fresh towels. They laid out his evening clothes on the bed every night. It was a refusal to let go, a desperate attempt to keep his ghost comfortable. The Queen herself underwent a transformation. She cast aside the colorful silks and satins of her earlier years. She put on black bombazine, a heavy, scratchy fabric that rustled with a sound like dry leaves, became her uniform. She wore a white widow's cap on her head, obscuring her face. She would wear these mourning blacks every day for the rest of her long life. The entire court was required to follow suit. The palace became a place of whispers and crepe, where laughter was forbidden and joy was a memory. She retreated from the world. For a decade, the Queen was invisible. She refused to open Parliament. She refused to ride in open carriages. She refused to be seen by the people she ruled. The public, who had cheered her at the coronation and marveled at her wedding, began to turn against her. They called her the Widow of Windsor. They grumbled that they were paying for a monarch who did not work. Someone even pinned a note to the gates of Buckingham Palace that read, "These commanding premises to be let or sold," in consequence of the late occupants' declining business. But she did not care. Her world had shrunk to the size of a locket around her neck, which contained a lock of Albert's hair. She slept every night with a plaster cast of his hand on the pillow beside her, needing the physical reminder of his touch to find rest. In her solitude, she found that the grandeur of Windsor and the noise of London were too much to bear. She needed somewhere wilder, somewhere quieter, where the landscape matched the desolation in her heart. She turned her eyes north, to the Highlands of Scotland. Balmoral Castle became her sanctuary. Imagine the shift in the air as the royal train chugged slowly north, leaving behind the smoke of the cities for the scent of heather and pine. The air in the Highlands was crisp, biting, and clean. It smelled of wet earth and ancient stone. Here, amidst the granite mountains and the rushing rivers, Victoria could breathe. Life at Balmoral was simpler. She would spend hours riding her pony through the glens, wrapped in a warm tartan shawl against the wind. She loved the sound of the bagpipes playing in the distance at dusk, a lonely, haunting melody that seemed to echo her own grief. She would sketch the landscape, capturing the purple of the blooming heather and the gray of the storm clouds. It was here, in this rugged isolation, that she formed one of the most controversial and significant relationships of her later life. John Brown was a Scottish gillie, a servant who looked after the horses and the dogs. He was rough, outspoken, and entirely unimpressed by royal protocol. He treated the Queen not as a deity, but as a woman. He spoke to her plainly, sometimes even bluntly. Where the courtiers tiptoed around her sadness, John Brown walked right through it. He brought her ponies to the door. He organized her picnics. He protected her with a fierce loyalty. Rumors swirled, of course. People whispered that they were too close, calling her Mrs. Brown, but Victoria ignored them. In his rough kindness, she found a tether to the living world. He gave her the strength to put one foot in front of the other. She also found solace at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. If Balmoral was her wild retreat, Osborne was her family home. Here, she could look out at the grey waters of the Solent Sea. She could sit in the garden where Albert had once planted trees. The view of the sea was endless and rhythmic, the waves lapping against the shore with a soothing regularity that calmed her nerves. Slowly, very slowly, the Queen began to return. It was not a sudden re-emergence, but a gradual thawing. The political world demanded her attention. 2 prime ministers defined this era of her life, William Gladstone and Benjamin Disraeli. She loathed Gladstone. He was stiff, serious, and spoke to her. She complained, as if she were a public meeting. But Disraeli was different. He was charming, flamboyant, and deeply respectful. He flattered her, calling her the Fairy Queen. He understood that she was a woman who needed to be wooed back to her duty. Disraeli gently coaxed her out of the shadows. He reminded her of the empire that waited for her. He was the one who handed her the title of Empress of India, a gift that sparked a new pride in her weary heart. Ironically, it was danger that truly brought the people back to her side. Throughout her life, there were at least 7 or 8 assassination attempts against Victoria. Men with pistols would lunge at her carriage, or fire shots that missed by inches. Each time, the Queen showed a nerves of steel courage. She refused to hide. She refused to let fear dictate her movements. This bravery reminded the British public of who she was. They saw the small elderly woman in black facing death without flinching, and their annoyance turned back into affection. Her routine became rigid, a clockwork existence that gave her stability. She wrote constantly. Her journals from this time, published as leaves from the Journal of Our Life in the Highlands, became bestsellers. They revealed a simple, human side to the monarch that the public adored. She wrote of tea on the grass, of walks in the snow, of the grief that never left but became a companion. Her family was expanding at an exponential rate. She had 9 children, and they were marrying into every royal house in Europe. By the end of her life, she had 42 grandchildren and 37 great-grandchildren. She was becoming the grandmother of Europe. Her influence was no longer just political, it was genetic. As the years passed, the recluse became an icon. The young girl who had ascended the throne in a dressing gown was now a distant memory. In her place sat a tiny, stout figure in black, a permanent fixture of the century. The empire, now vast and complex, prepared to celebrate her longevity with a pageantry that the world had never seen. The first great celebration came in 1887, the Golden Jubilee, 50 years on the throne. It was a milestone that seemed almost impossible. London shook off its soot and dressed itself in color. The city was transformed into a festival. Miles of bunting and flags fluttered in the summer breeze, turning the gray streets into canyons of red, white, and blue. Kings and princes from across Europe and the Empire flocked to London. The procession to Westminster Abbey was a river of gold and steel, but amidst the glittering uniforms of the hussars and the dragoons, the focus was on the small, open carriage in the center. There she sat, refusing to wear the heavy state crown or robes. Instead, she wore her black dress, but this time she allowed herself a bonnet with white lace and diamonds. The roar of the crowd was deafening. God Save the Queen was sung by thousands of throats, a wall of sound that washed over her. She wrote in her diary that the noise was quite deafening, but also very touching. The people had forgiven her absence. They were cheering for her survival. 10 years later, the spectacle was repeated, but on an even grander scale. The Diamond Jubilee of 1897 marked 60 years of reign. No British monarch had ever reached this milestone. Victoria was now 78 years old. She was frail. Arthritis had crippled her knees, and her eyesight was failing due to cataracts. She could not manage the steps of St. Paul's Cathedral. So, the service was brought to her. In a moment of poignant improvisation, the massive Thanksgiving service was held outside at the foot of the cathedral steps. The Queen remained in her open carriage, holding a parasol against the sun. The bishops and the choir stood on the steps, singing the hymns into the open air of London. This jubilee was dubbed the Festival of the British Empire. It was a display of global reach. The procession included troops from every corner of the map. There were Canadian Mounties in their scarlet tunics, Indian Lancers in turbans and silks, troops from Australia, New Zealand, and Africa. It was a living map of the world, marching through the streets of London. Technology was there to witness it. For the first time, moving images were captured. The invention of the cinematograph meant that grainy, flickering black and white footage of the Queen nodding to her people exists to this day. We can see her, a small, moving figure in a sea of horses, waving gently. That night, chain beacons were lit on the hilltops across the country. From the mountains of Scotland to the cliffs of Dover, fires burned in the darkness, a ring of light connecting the island in a circle of celebration. The Queen, sitting at Windsor, looked out at the lights and sent a telegraph message to her vast empire. It was simple and tender. From my heart, I thank my beloved people. May God bless them. The affection of the crowd was now total. She had become more than a queen. She was a symbol of stability in a world that was changing too fast. She was the one constant thing in a life of flux. But all reigns must end. The century turned. The 1900s arrived. The Queen was tired. Her health began to fade in the winter of 1900. She had outlived her husband, her friends, and even 3 of her own children. The weight of the years was finally pressing down. In January 1901, she traveled to Osborne House for the last time. She loved the peace of the island, the sound of the waves, and the memories of Albert that saturated the halls. She lay in her bed, surrounded by her family. Her grandson, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, was there, holding her with a tenderness that belied the war he would later wage against her country. The room was quiet. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the distant, rhythmic shushing of the sea against the shore. On January 22, 1901, at 6:30 in the evening, the end came. It was gentle. There was no struggle. She simply ceased to breathe. Her reign of 63 years, 7 months, and 2 days was over. But even in death, Victoria had one final command to give. She had left strict instructions for her funeral. She was tired of black. She had worn it for 40 years. Now she wanted white. She requested a white funeral. It was to be a celebration of a reunion, not a mourning of a loss. She believed with absolute certainty that she was going to see Albert again. Her coffin was draped in white silk and covered with the Union Jack. But it was what was inside the coffin that told the true story of her heart. She had ordered a collection of sacred objects to be buried with her, a secret museum of her love. On her right side, placed carefully by her request, was one of Prince Albert's dressing gowns. Beside it was the plaster cast of his hand that she had slept with for 4 decades. On her left side, she placed a photograph of John Brown and a lock of his hair, a nod to the other man who had supported her. Hidden in her hand, so as not to offend the family. Rings, bracelets, and lockets were layered upon her. She went to her grave, crowded with memories. The funeral procession was a final moment of magic. As the coffin was carried across the Solent from the Isle of Wight to the mainland, the grey winter sky seemed to merge with the leaden sea. A fleet of battleships formed a corridor of steel, firing their guns in a slow, thunderous salute. The smoke from the cannons rolled over the water like a shroud. In London, the silence was absolute. The city that had roared for her jubilees now stood still. People wept openly in the streets. The mother of the nation was gone. It felt as if the roof had been taken off the house. The Victorian era, that long, transformative, noisy, brilliant epoch, had officially ended. The Edwardian age was beginning, but for a moment, the world simply stopped. She was buried at the Frogmore Mausoleum in the grounds of Windsor Park. She was laid to rest beside her beloved Albert. The inscription above their tomb reads, "Farewell, best beloved. Here at last I shall rest with thee. With thee in Christ I shall rise again." And so, the great queen, the small woman who cast such a long shadow, finally closed her eyes, reuniting with the memory of the love that had guided her for so long. The noise of the steam engines and the bustle of the empire seemed to hush for a moment, respecting the silence of her departure. The era was over, but its echoes would last forever. As we leave the narrative of her life, we can now drift deeper into the quiet legacy she left behind. Take a deep breath and let the story settle. We have journeyed through the smog and the steam. We have walked the cobbled streets of a rapidly changing world and witnessed the rise of an empire that stretched across the globe. But now the great engines of industry have fallen silent. The clamor of the factory floor has faded into the distance. We are left now with the quieter echoes of the Victorian age. This is the time to drift through the legacy that was left behind, not in steel and stone alone, but in the mind and the heart. We turn our gaze to the library and the parlor. We look to the quiet museum halls and the gentle sanctuary of the home. It is here, in the soft sepia tones of memory, that we find the true texture of the era. Let us first step into the hushed atmosphere of the library. In this era, the written word became a universe unto itself. It was the golden age of the novel. Before this time, stories were often short or spoken, but the Victorians mastered the art of the long, immersive narrative. Think of the great works of Charles Dickens. He did not merely write stories. He painted entire worlds in ink. He captured the very fog of London and the characters that dwelt within it. When people opened his books, they were transported. They could smell the river and hear the bustling crowds. This was the power of the novel. It was a dominant force. And it was not just Dickens. There was William Makepeace Thackeray with his sharp wit, and George Eliot with her deep understanding of the human rural soul. These writers created companions for the lonely and adventures for the sedentary. Consider the Brontë sisters up on the wild, windswept moors of Yorkshire. In their isolation, they spun tales of immense passion and haunting beauty. They wrote while the wind howled against the stone walls of the parsonage. You can almost hear the scratching of their pens. It is a rhythmic, soothing sound. The nib dips into the inkwell. It scratches across the parchment. A world is born on the page. Stories did not always arrive all at once. They often came in pieces. This was the age of serialization. Magazines like The Strand or All the Year Round were the lifeblood of entertainment. Imagine the anticipation Families would gather around the fire, waiting for the next installment. It was a shared experience, a communal dreaming. They would read aloud to one another. The father might read the latest chapter of a mystery, while the fire crackled in the hearth. The shadows would dance on the walls as the story unfolded. Poetry, too, held a sacred place in the Victorian heart. It was not just an intellectual exercise. It was a way to process grief and beauty. Alfred Lord Tennyson wrote in memoriam as a vast landscape of mourning and hope. His words had a cadence that mimicked the rolling sea. Robert Browning explored the minds of characters with psychological depth. To read their verse is to slip into a rhythm. It is a lullaby of language. The meter rises and falls like a chest breathing in deep sleep. And let us not forget the children. It was in this era that the child became a figure of innocence and wonder. In 1865, a mathematician took a boat ride and told a story. Alice in Wonderland was born. It was a departure from the rigid rules of the real world. It was a dive into a rabbit hole of pure imagination. In a world of factories and timetables, this literature provided a necessary escape. It was a soft place to land. Then there came the fog. Out of the gaslight stepped Sherlock Holmes. He was the embodiment of Victorian logic. He observed the world with a calm, detached precision. To read a Holmes story is to feel safe. No matter how chaotic the crime, the detective would restore order. He would explain the inexplicable. He brought reason to the dark, twisting streets of London. Darkness also had its allure. The Gothic revival brought us tales of Dracula and Jekyll and Hyde. These were stories that explored the shadows, but even in their fear, they offered a thrill that could be enjoyed from the safety of a warm armchair. They were reminders of the mysteries that science had not yet illuminated. Books were everywhere. Literacy rates soared as education became available to the masses. The ability to read was a key that unlocked the world. Circulating libraries, like Moody's, became cultural hubs. You could borrow a volume bound in cloth and gold leaf. The physical beauty of these books is something we can still appreciate. Imagine holding one now. Feel the weight of the hardcover in your lap. It is solid and grounding. The cover is textured. The pages are thick and creamy. They smell of old paper and leather. It is a scent of history, a scent of comfort. We turn the page slowly. The sound is a soft whisper. In the quiet of the library, the flickering candlelight illuminates the text. The rest of the room fades into darkness. There is only the words, only the story. We drift from the world of fiction into the realm of discovery. Beyond the pages of books, the minds of the era were exploring the very fabric of nature. The Victorian era saw an explosion of scientific curiosity. It was a time when humanity began to organize the natural world. At the center of this shift stood Charles Darwin. His publication of On the Origin of Species in 1859 changed everything. It was a quiet revolution. It proposed a slow and steady change over eons. It challenged the old timelines. There was conflict at first. Faith and science wrestled with one another. But over time, a reconciliation began to form. People began to see the complexity of evolution as a new kind of miracle, a miracle of deep time. This fascination with nature filtered down to the everyday person. It became a hobby. It became an obsession. They called it pterodomania or fern fever. Victorians fell in love with ferns. They would scour the countryside to collect different species. They built glass cases called Wardian cases to keep them humid and green inside their smoky cities. Imagine the earthy smell of a fern case. It is the scent of damp soil and moss. It is a tiny captured forest in the corner of the drawing room. It is a connection to the wild. This desire to collect extended to everything. The Natural History Museum in London was built as a cathedral to nature. Its architecture is Romanesque and grand, but instead of saints, the carvings depict plants and animals. Inside the great halls, skeleton after skeleton stands in silent vigil. It was here that the word dinosaur was coined by Richard Owen, terrible lizard. For the first time, humanity realized that giants had once walked the earth. Imagine standing in that vast hall. The air is cool and still. The silence is profound. You are surrounded by the deep history of the planet. Science also turned its gaze to the human body. Medicine made giant leaps. Joseph Lister introduced antiseptics. He brought cleanliness to the chaos of the hospital. James Simpson discovered the properties of chloroform. Pain could now be managed. The suffering of surgery was reduced. And through the wards walked Florence Nightingale with her lamp. She transformed nursing into a profession of dignity and order. She brought hygiene and compassion to the bedside. Her shadow on the wall was a comfort to the wounded. Explorers pushed the boundaries of the map. They searched for the source of the Nile. They trekked through jungles and across deserts. They brought back specimens to be classified. Every beetle and every bird was given a Latin name. It was an attempt to understand the mind of the Creator through His creation. Geology challenged the age of the earth. Men studied the layers of rock. They read the strata like pages in a book. They realized the world was older than they had ever dreamed. Imagine looking through a microscope in a Victorian study. The brass instrument is heavy and cold to the touch. You adjust the mirror to catch the light. You focus the lens. Suddenly, a drop of water becomes a teeming world. The mist rises off the glass. You are seeing the invisible. You are seeing the building blocks of life. It is a methodical and slow process. It requires patience. It is a meditation on the details. This intellectual progress was matched by a shifting moral landscape in the home. The Victorian home was more than just a house. It was a sanctuary. It was a fortress against the grime and noise of the industrial world. At the center of this ideal was the family. The concept of the angel in the house prevailed. It suggested that while men battled in the public sphere of business and politics, women were the guardians of the private sphere. They were the moral compass. They created a space of peace and virtue. Of course, the reality was often more complex, but the ideal persisted. It shaped the way people lived. The heart of the home was the parlor or drawing room. This was the stage upon which domestic life was played out, and it was a crowded stage. The Victorians had a fear of empty space known as horror vacui. They filled every corner. Heavy furniture made of dark mahogany or rosewood dominated the room. Tables were covered in velvet cloths. Whatnots displayed collections of shells and china figurines. The walls were papered in busy patterns. Imagine the texture of this room. The upholstery is plush and deep. The curtains are thick to keep out the drafts. A grandfather clock stands in the hallway. Its ticking is the heartbeat of the house. Tick, tock, tick, tock. It is a steady, rhythmic sound that marks the passing of quiet hours. Tea time was the central ritual of the day. It was not merely a pause for refreshment. It was a ceremony. The best china was brought out, cups of delicate porcelain painted with roses. Silver teapots were polished until they gleamed like mirrors. Steam curled up from the hot liquid, carrying the scent of bergamot and assam. The sound of a silver spoon clinking against the side of a cup is a quintessentially Victorian sound. It is a gentle chime of civilization. Behind the scenes, a hierarchy of servants kept the machine running. The butler presided over the pantry. The housekeeper managed the linens. The scullery maid scrubbed the floors. They moved silently through the house, using back stairs and hidden corridors. They were the invisible hands that lit the fires and polished the boots. Etiquette ruled this world. There were rules for everything. How to leave a calling card, how to address a bishop, how to mourn. These rules provided a structure. They created a sense of order in social interactions. It was a dance where everyone knew the steps. Sundays were days of strict observance. The house would fall even quieter. No games were played. Only serious books were read. It was a day of rest and reflection. In the evening, the family might gather around the piano. The piano was the center of entertainment. Someone would play a ballad or a hymn. The soft notes would drift through the parlor. The music would mingle with the warmth of the hearth. Consider the warmth of that fire. The coal glows red and orange in the grate. The heat radiates outward, warming your hands and face. Outside, the London fog might be pressing against the window pane. But inside, all is safe. All is cozy. You sink deeper into the armchair. Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management sits on the table. It is a guide to every aspect of this life, from cooking a goose to managing a budget. It represents the desire to control and perfect the domestic world. While the home was a sanctuary, the streets outside were seeing the first steps of social reform. The Victorian era was not just about stasis, it was about improvement. The conscience of the nation was slowly waking up. Life for the common person began to change. The Factory Acts were passed. Slowly, the long hours of labor were reduced. The practice of sending small children into the mines and mills was curtailed. The silence of the mills at the end of a shortened shift was a victory. It meant rest. It meant childhood could be reclaimed. In 1870, the Education Act was passed. Schools were built across the country. Imagine the clear ringing of a school bell in a brick courtyard. It is a new sound. It calls the children in from the streets. Inside, they sit at wooden desks. They write on slate tablets with chalk. The air smells of chalk dust and old wood. They are learning to read. They are learning to count. A generation is being lifted up. Voices that had been silent began to speak. The suffragette movement began to take root in the later years. Women began to organize. They asked for the right to vote. They asked for a voice in the destiny of the nation. It was a slow struggle, but the seeds were sown here. Philanthropy became a duty. The wealthy felt a responsibility to the poor. The Salvation Army was founded to offer soup and salvation to the destitute. Charity work became a respectable pastime. Housing was improved. Slums were cleared to make way for better buildings with light and air. Public parks were created. These were the lungs of the city. Land was set aside not for factories, but for leisure. Imagine walking through one of these new parks. The grass is green and trimmed. Trees have been planted in orderly rows. You can hear the laughter of children playing. You can see couples walking arm in arm. The air is fresher here, away from the smoke. It is a gift of space. The cooperative movement began. People banded together to buy goods at fair prices. It was a time of organizing, of building structures to support the weak. Voting rights expanded through a series of reform acts. More and more men were given the vote. The quiet dignity of the voting booth became a part of life. The temperance movement urged sobriety. Tea and coffee became the drinks of the new respectable working class. There is a sense of hope in these reforms, a sense that the world could be made better, not through violent revolution, but through steady, orderly progress. It is a gentle climb upward. The era left a mark not just on laws, but on the very aesthetic of the world. We look now at the buildings and the art. The Victorian legacy is visible in the bricks and mortar of our cities. Architecture underwent a Gothic revival. The Victorians looked back to the Middle Ages for inspiration. They saw in the Gothic style a spiritual truth. The Houses of Parliament rise up beside the Thames. Their spires and towers pierce the sky. They are covered in intricate stone carvings. They look like a fantasy made real. The pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood changed the way art looked. Painters like Dante Gabriel Rossetti and John Everett Millais rejected the dark, muddy colors of the past. They painted with brilliant jewel tones. They painted scenes from mythology and nature. Their work is vivid and dreamlike. Imagine the visual richness of one of these paintings. The green of the moss is electric. The red of a velvet dress is deep and glowing. They focused on every leaf and every blade of grass. It was a celebration of detail. Then came the arts and crafts movement, led by William Morris. He reacted against the machine-made goods of the factories. He wanted things to be beautiful and useful. He designed wallpapers with intricate floral patterns, vines and birds and flowers intertwining. Imagine a room papered in Morris print. It is like being inside a garden. The patterns repeat in a soothing rhythm. He championed the handmade, the rough texture of a woven rug, the imperfection of a hand-thrown pot. The cities themselves took on a distinctive look. Red brick became the material of choice. It was warm and durable. Entire neighborhoods were built in this terracotta hue. Even today, when the sun hits a Victorian terrace, the red brick glows. It absorbs the warmth of the day. Stained glass saw a resurgence. It was not just for churches anymore. Front doors had panels of colored glass. Light would stream through them, painting the hallway in pools of blue and gold and crimson. It was a play of light, a way to bring color into the gray days. The aesthetic movement declared art for art's sake. Oscar Wilde and his circle believed that beauty was the highest goal. Life itself should be a work of art. Fashion shifted and changed, from the wide crinolines that took up so much space to the bustle that changed the silhouette. Women were sculptures in silk and lace. Public statues and monuments were erected in squares and gardens. They honored engineers and poets and queens. They stood as solid reminders of achievement, and the infrastructure itself was beautiful. The great railway stations were cathedrals of steam. St. Pancras in London is a marvel of brick and iron and glass. It is a palace for trains. The bridges that spanned the rivers were feats of engineering, but they were also decorated with ironwork. As we reflect on these beauties, we let the history fade further into a soft blur of atmosphere. The sharp edges of the facts begin to soften. We are no longer studying the era, we are feeling it. The Victorian age was a time of contradictions. It was a time of steam and silence, of rigid rules and wild invention. It was a world of factories and a world of fairies. But looking back now, the noise fades, the clamor of the industry dies away. We are left only with the beautiful sepia-toned images. We see a world that built the foundations of our own, the sewers, the railways, the schools, the parks. They are still with us. They are the bones of our cities. But tonight, we are interested in the spirit. It is a legacy of endurance, a legacy of imagination. The dust motes dance in the shaft of light from a high window. The smell of old books lingers in the air. The sound of a piano plays a soft lullaby in the distance. The fog rolls in, wrapping the world in a blanket of white. The gas lamps flicker and hum, and now we let the history books close gently. We place the heavy leather volume back on the shelf. The story is told. The era is resting. We drift even deeper into the purely sensory whispers of the past. The ticking clock, the rain on the roof, the warmth of the fire. The Victorian world sleeps, and so do we. The great wheels of history have stopped turning. The dates and the names have faded into the mists of time. We are no longer concerned with the rise of kings or the fall of governments. We have left the noise of the century behind us. Now we enter a space of pure atmosphere. This is a journey into the quietest corners of the Victorian world. It is a place of stillness and sensory detail, a place where the only movement is the slow drift of a cloud or the flicker of a candle flame. We are here to rest. We are here to breathe the air of a slower time. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breathing deepen. We are going to walk very slowly through the lingering whispers of the empire. We begin our drift in the sanctuary of the Victorian garden. It is a summer afternoon, late in the day, when the sun hangs low and golden in the sky. The air is warm and still. We stand at the entrance to a manicured botanical garden. The gate is made of wrought iron, painted a deep, glossy black. It swings open with a heavy, silent grace. Beneath our feet is a pathway of crushed gravel. Step forward, crunch, crunch. It is a satisfying, grounding sound. The path stretches out before us, bordered by perfect emerald green lawns. The Victorians loved order in nature, and nowhere is this more visible than here. Look at the flower beds. They are not wild or scattered. They are planted in precise geometric patterns. This is known as carpet bedding. Thousands of small, vibrant flowers, red geraniums, blue lobelias, yellow marigolds are arranged to look like a living tapestry woven into the earth. The colors are rich and saturated. As we walk past, the scent rises up to meet us. It is the heavy, sweet perfume of damask roses. These are old roses, with tightly packed petals of velvet crimson and soft pink. Take a moment to imagine leaning in close to one. The scent is heady and intoxicating. It smells of summer and memory. There is a language here, too. It is the language of flowers, or florography. In this era, every bloom holds a secret message. The red rose whispers of love. The lily speaks of purity. The blue violet murmurs of faithfulness. To walk through this garden is to walk through a conversation of the heart, spoken in petals and leaves. It is a silent dialogue of emotion, preserved in the quiet air. We move deeper into the garden. The gravel path curves gently, leading us toward a structure of glass and iron. It is a hothouse, a crystal palace in miniature. We step inside. The air here is different. It is warm, humid, and thick with the smell of damp earth and tropical greenery. The light is diffused by the glass panes above, creating a soft, milky glow. Here, The Victorians kept their treasures from the far reaches of the empire. Orchids hang from the ceiling, their roots dangling in the moist air. Their flowers are strange and beautiful, like jewels carved from wax. In the corner of the hothouse stands a rockery dedicated to ferns. The obsession with ferns, known as pterodomania, is alive here. The fronds are a deep, cooling green. They unfurl slowly, spiral by spiral, in a display of geometric perfection. The atmosphere is ancient and calm. It is a place to stand and breathe in the oxygen, to feel the moisture on your skin, to let the outside world disappear completely. Leaving the hothouse, we find a wrought iron bench situated under the shade of a weeping willow. The metal is cool to the touch. We sit for a moment. In the distance, we can see a white wooden gazebo. Inside, a tea service has been laid out, but there is no one there. It is a still life waiting for a painter. A silver teapot, porcelain cups sit on saucers, delicate and white. A plate of scones rests under a linen cloth. The scene is frozen in a perfect moment of anticipation. The only sound is the lazy buzzing of a bumblebee. It hovers over a patch of lavender, its wings creating a low, hypnotic drone. Bzzzzz, bzzzzz. It is the sound of deep summer. The lavender bushes are a haze of purple, their dry, herbal scent mixing with the sweetness of the roses. Everything is slow. The shadows of the trees stretch long across the grass. The afternoon is endless. There is no rush. There is nowhere else to be. We are simply here in this garden of order and beauty, letting the peace of the plants settle into our bones. From the verdant green of the garden, we drift softly indoors. We move from the scent of flowers to the scent of lavender, sachets, and cedarwood. We are entering the private world of the dressing room. This is a space of texture and touch. The curtains are drawn against the afternoon sun, casting the room in a dim, restful twilight. The Victorian era was defined by its fabrics. It was a world of silk and lace, of wool and velvet. Imagine running your hand across the surface of a dressing table. It is polished mahogany, smooth and cool. On top of it lies a pair of gloves. Pick them up in your mind. They are made of the finest kid leather, or perhaps a heavy cream-colored silk. They are soft, so incredibly soft. They yield to the touch. Slip them on. They fit perfectly, hugging the fingers. A second skin of luxury. The act of dressing in this time was a ritual. It was a slow layering of protection and beauty. Think of the layers, the crisp, clean cotton of the chemise against the skin, the structure of the corset, holding the body in a gentle embrace, the rustle of the petticoats, starched linen, layer upon layer, creating a bell shape that moves with a life of its own. There is a specific sound that defines this room. It is the sound of taffeta. Taffeta is a stiff, crisp silk that makes a whispering noise when it moves. Swish, swish. It is a sound of elegance. Imagine a woman walking across the room in a taffeta gown. The fabric sighs as it brushes against the floor. It is a rhythmic, calming white noise. Open a drawer in the tall wardrobe. The scent of dried lavender drifts out. It is a clean, sharp smell that speaks of domestic care. Inside, neat stacks of shawls are waiting. Some are made of cashmere, brought all the way from India. They are light as air, but incredibly warm. Imagine wrapping one around your shoulders. It settles there like a warm hug. The wool is soft, not scratchy. It is a comfort against the chill of the evening. On the table sits a fan. It is made of ivory and lace. Open it. Snap. The sound is sharp but delicate. The lace is intricate, a web of threads woven into patterns of flowers and vines. Hold it up to the dim light. You can see through the tiny holes in the pattern. The fan moves the air gently against your face. It is a cool breeze, controlled by your own hand. There are ribbons of velvet here, too. Deep burgundy, midnight blue, forest green. Velvet is a fabric that demands to be touched. Run your finger along a strip of velvet ribbon. It has a nap, a grain. One way it is smooth. The other way it offers a slight resistance. It absorbs the light, appearing dark and rich. Everything in this room is tactile. The cool, smooth surface of a pearl button, the heavy, cold weight of a silver hairbrush, the rhythmic brushing of hair, 1, 2, 3, long, slow strokes. It is a meditative act. The world outside the window is forgotten. There is only the feeling of silk, the smell of lavender, and the quiet safety of the room. We are wrapped in layers of comfort. We are shielded from the world. Wrapped in this warmth, we move to the library. The day is fading, and the shadows are lengthening. We sit at a heavy oak desk. It is time to write. In the Victorian age, communication was not instant. It was a slow, deliberate art. It required patience and focus. On the desk sits a heavy glass inkwell. The lid is open, revealing the black liquid inside. Beside it lies a dip pen. The handle is made of mother of pearl, cool and iridescent. The nib is steel, sharp and precise. Pick up the pen. It balances perfectly in the hand. Dip the nib into the ink. Watch as the black fluid coats the metal. Lift it out. Tap it gently against the side to remove the excess. Now, look at the paper. It is heavy cream stationery, thick and textured. It is laid paper, meaning it has faint horizontal lines from the manufacturing process. It feels substantial under the hand. Place the nib on the paper. Scratch. The sound is distinct. It is the sound of thought becoming visible. The handwriting style is copperplate. It consists of elegant loops and sloping curves. It requires a steady hand and a calm mind. You cannot rush. If you rush, the ink will splatter. You must breathe slowly, upstroke, downstroke, thin line, thick line. The pen moves across the page in a rhythmic dance. The words form slowly. My dearest, I remain yours. There is a profound silence in this activity. The only sounds are the scratching of the nib and the occasional dip into the inkwell. Dip, scratch, dip, scratch. It is a hypnotic cycle. Dust motes dance in the light of the oil lamp that sits on the corner of the desk. The flame is steady, enclosed in a glass chimney. It casts a warm yellow pool of light onto the paper, leaving the corners of the room in shadow. When the letter is finished, there is one final ritual: the sealing wax. A stick of red wax is held over the candle flame. It begins to melt. A drop falls onto the folded paper. Then another. It is a thick, molten puddle. It smells of resin and smoke. While it is still hot, you take the brass seal and press it firmly into the wax. Hold it there for a heartbeat. Lift it away. The wax cools and hardens, bearing the impression of an initial or a crest. The letter is sealed. It is a secret now, safe and secure. The act of writing has slowed time down. The minutes have ticked by unnoticed. The mind is clear. The focus has been singular. There is a deep satisfaction in this analog process, a feeling of completion. The pen is wiped clean. The inkwell is closed. The desk is tidy. The day's work is done. We look up from the desk and turn towards the window. Outside, the day is ending. We are witnessing the transition to twilight in the city. The sky is a deep, luminous blue, the color of a bruised plum. The sun has gone, but the darkness has not yet fully arrived. Down on the street, the world is transforming. A figure appears in the distance. He carries a long pole. He is the lamplighter. He stops at the tall, black iron post on the corner. He reaches up with his pole. There is a faint pop, then a hiss. A small flame bursts into life inside the glass lantern. A soft, yellow glow spills out onto the cobblestones. He moves to the next lamp, and the next. One by one, he connects the dots of light in the gathering gloom. It is a constellation brought down to earth. With the twilight comes the fog. It is not a heavy, choking smog tonight, but a soft, white mist that rolls in from the river. It wraps around the buildings, softening their edges. The sharp corners of the brick houses become blurred and dreamlike. The gas lamps gain halos, diffracted by the moisture in the air. The street seems to narrow, becoming more intimate. The sounds of the city are changing. During the day, there was the clatter of hooves and the shout of vendors. Now, everything is muffled. The shutters are being pulled down on the shop fronts across the way. Clack, clack. The closed signs are turned. The commerce of the empire has ceased. Smoke rises from the chimney pots, climbing straight up into the still air. It smells of coal fires, a scent that defines the Victorian winter evening. It is not an unpleasant smell. It is the scent of hearth and home. It signals that people are indoors, gathering around their fires. Occasionally, a carriage passes by, but it is moving slowly. We hear the rhythmic clip-clop of the horses' hooves on the stones. Clip-clop, clip-clop. The sound echoes slightly in the damp air, then fades into the distance. It leaves behind a deeper silence than before. We watch the windows of the houses opposite. One by one, they light up with a golden glow. We can see the silhouettes of people moving inside, closing curtains, sitting down to dinner. It is a tableau of domestic peace. The moon begins to rise over the rooftops, a pale silver coin against the indigo sky. The night watchman walks his beat, his footsteps heavy and regular. All is well. The silence seems to say, all is well. We turn away from the window. We leave the city to its slumber. We retreat to the deepest, most private sanctuary of all, the bedroom. The room is dark, lit only by the embers of the fire in the grate. They glow with a deep, pulsing red heat. Occasionally, a piece of coal settles with a soft rustle, sending a tiny spark up the chimney. The light is low and comforting. It creates long, soft shadows that stretch across the floor. This is the night watch, the time when the world stops. We approach the bed. It is high and vast, a 4-poster bed draped in heavy velvet curtains to keep out the drafts. We climb in. The mattress is stuffed with feathers. It yields under our weight, holding us, supporting us. Pull up the quilt. It is heavy. The weight is good. It presses down gently, grounding us. It is a patchwork quilt, stitched by hand, a labor of love. We are buried under layers of warmth. The sheets are crisp, cool cotton that warms quickly against the skin. The room is absolutely silent, save for one sound. On the mantelpiece sits a clock. Tick-tock, tick-tock. It is a slow, steady, mesmerizing rhythm. It does not rush. It measures the seconds with infinite patience. It is the heartbeat of the house. Lie back against the pillows. They are soft and white, smelling faintly of the lavender from the wardrobe. Your eyelids feel heavy. The events of the day are far away. The garden, the silk, the letter, the twilight, they are all just images now, drifting through the mind like leaves on a slow-moving river. You are safe here. The walls are thick stone. The door is closed. The empire outside is asleep. The ships are at anchor in the harbor, their sails furled. The trains are motionless in their sheds, the steam venting slowly into the night. The factories are silent. The queen is asleep in her palace. The hum of the world has stopped. There is nothing you need to do. There is nothing you need to fix. You are simply a part of this quiet, sleeping history. You are suspended in the amber of a peaceful past. The firelight dims. The red glow fades to a soft pink, then to gray ash. The darkness is warm and velvety. The ticking of the clock seems to slow down even further. The fire has burned down to a soft glow, and the great empire has fallen into a peaceful slumber. The ships are at anchor, the trains are still, and the history books are closed. You are safe, you are warm, and you are part of this long, quiet river of time. Thank you for joining me, the sleeping scribe, on this journey tonight. I wish you the deepest, most restful sleep. Good night.